Kathleen Calderwood reporting there from New Zealand. Donald Trump says he's secured total and permanent US access to Greenland in a deal with NATO that could involve other alliance members making greater military contributions to ward off threats from China and Russia. News of some kind of deal came as the US president walked back his tariff threats and ruled out taking Greenland by force. Deutsche Welle correspondent Arthur Sullivan joins us now from Berlin. Arthur, g'day. So how are EU leaders reacting to the chaos of dealing with this US president? First off, the aggressive threats, then the apparent back down, and then the assertions of triumph by Donald Trump.
Yeah, so Joe, look, in the world of 2026, there are lots and lots of strange weeks, but this truly was a crazy one here in European politics. So to try and make sense of it all, the EU leaders met in Brussels on Thursday, and that emergency meeting was called a few days ago, and at that time the US president was ramping up rhetoric on using military force to take control of Greenland. So the meeting was originally envisaged as a place where Europe would come up with a strong response, which could have involved all kinds of serious economic countermeasures. But now that Trump has pulled back sharply both from that talk and also from the threat of tariffs, it left the leaders in a somewhat strange position. The climb down means that the EU statement, which was released late last night after the meeting, was a bit calmer than would otherwise have been the case. The leaders talked about the stabilisation of trade relations, and it said that the EU would proceed with the trade agreement that it reached last July with the US. So in the wake of Trump's threats, the EU had briefly suspended that deal and, as I said, was considering other strong economic countermeasures. But the statement did also refer to the need for Europe to rapidly develop its own strategic autonomy and independence. And that was an indication that it knows that the days of relying on the US for perhaps anything are probably over.
But what's known about what's in this so-called deal that has led to the apparent back down by Donald Trump, but then him still saying he's secured all this extensive access to Greenland? And was that already there anyway?
Yeah, I mean, there's really not much that's known yet because nothing officially has been said. We're only going by statements, by comments from the likes of Trump and by briefings from EU officials and other officials who've been at the meetings that were involved. So Trump has spoken about a, quote, infinite deal that is, quote, forever, a framework about the future of Greenland, which in his words gives the US so-called total access. But all we really know about this apparent deal is that it came from talks between the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and Trump. So it wasn't with the Danish or the Greenlandic sides, it wasn't with the EU leaders, and no deal has actually been done. What appears to have been agreed is simply to have further talks. So talks probably between Trump and Rutte, or indeed talks possibly involving the Danish side and the Greenlandic side. And this agreement to simply have further talks was enough for Trump to take the threats off the table. Now, what several officials say was discussed is the possible renegotiation of a 75-year-old pact treaty between the US and Denmark, which relates to NATO's role in Greenland and the number of US bases there. So the future talks, if they happen, will obviously focus on this. Trump has talked about Greenland becoming part of the so-called Golden Dome missile defense system for North America. Another talking point apparently between Trump and Rutte related to possible US investment in mining there. Now, the US military role in Greenland, as you said, has always been a topic. The US did once have more than 10,000 soldiers in Greenland. That is now around 150. The agreement that stands from 75 years ago already allows, as you said, the US to set up bases on the territory as long as Denmark's sovereignty is not impacted. And just briefly, to give the Danish and Greenlandic perspectives, Denmark's Prime Minister said on Thursday the country was open to renegotiating that agreement, but only if the question of its sovereignty did not come up. She also emphasised that Rutte was not negotiating on Denmark's behalf. And finally, the leader of Greenland put it very succinctly when he said, "We choose the Kingdom of Denmark, we choose the EU, we choose NATO."
And so how has this Davos confrontation reshaped US-EU relations? And also, Arthur, I'm interested to hear what impact that really powerful speech by the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, had there as well, talking about this rupture in the international rules-based order.
Yeah, indeed. So much of this, the oddness of the whole thing is that so much of it played out in the Swiss mountain resort of Davos, because, of course, that's where all the leaders were this week at the World Economic Forum. And it really has been a defining week in the transatlantic relationship. It's hard to see it not being that when we look back on this in years to come. So even if it ends without a new trade war and with fears of a possible invasion of Greenland reduce, reduced, the sense for many here is that if Trump is willing to threaten invading NATO territory, even if it is just some negotiation tactic, then trust is broken. And I think one really fascinating indication of how US-EU relations are being shaped came in Davos from Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday when he launched a really stinging attack on Europe's leaders after meeting Trump. He called Europe a, quote, fragmented kaleidoscope of small and middle powers. He said it looked lost, trying to convince Trump to force Russia to end the war. And you mentioned Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister. I think his strong and very well-received speech probably did jar a little bit for some European listeners when they compared it to their own leaders, because I think a lot of European voters certainly may well look at some of their leaders, may listen to what Carney had to say, may listen to what Zelensky had to say, and probably feel a deep frustration with what they perceive to be their own leaders' inability to stand up to the US president's threats and a tendency, perhaps perceived or real, to placate him, regardless of what he says. So as for what's happening going forward, whatever way you choose to interpret the events of the last few weeks, I think there's no doubt that something has shifted profoundly in the US-EU relationship. And these few days may come to represent something of a turning point, at least for the duration of the Trump presidency.
And so how warm has the relationship been between Volodymyr Zelensky and Europe over the last couple of years? Did his statements in the wake of Davos come as a bit of a shock, or had there been indications that the relationship had soured a little? But also, is there a possibility that Volodymyr Zelensky is crafting his words carefully in the wake of that Donald Trump meeting to ensure he keeps Donald Trump on side?
Yeah, I think what Zelensky said yesterday did come as a shock, certainly. It was so strong, the criticism of Europe. I mean, Europe and the EU has been one of Ukraine's main backers. I mean, some of the countries on the eastern flank of NATO and the EU, Poland, for example, others in Central and Eastern Europe, have been huge military and financial supporters of Ukraine. So for Zelensky to come out and speak so strongly definitely raised eyebrows. But again, some of his comments were comments that I guess will be certainly agreed with by some in Europe, because they probably feel some of those same frustrations. As for the strategic basis of why he's saying them, obviously what also came out yesterday after the meeting was that there are now going to be possibly trilateral talks between Ukraine, the US and Russia going forward regarding the ending of the war in Ukraine. And that, very pointedly, those talks will not involve the EU. So perhaps Zelensky is trying as best he can in advance of those talks to get on Trump's good side, as we've seen many leaders do many times before, in anticipation of those talks happening. And I mean, we've seen how much Trump attacked the EU this week in his speeches and over the last several weeks. And perhaps Zelensky feels that if he does likewise, it may well endear him somewhat to Trump in advance of talks where he's clearly going to need the US firmly on the Ukrainian side if they're going to get the kind of deal they want from any possible peace negotiations.
Indeed. OK, good to talk to you. Arthur Sullivan there in Berlin. This is ABC News Top Stories. Police are treating a triple fatal shooting in the central west of New South Wales as a domestic violence incident. Authorities are searching for 37-year-old Julian Ingram, who's suspected of shooting 2 women and a man dead yesterday. Specialist police teams have been flown into Lake Cargellico to assist with the manhunt. Opposition leader Susan Lee insists she will remain the leader of the Liberal Party despite the National Party leaving the coalition. Several Liberal ministers have come to her defence, claiming the party room backs her leadership. But Nationals leader David Littleproud has indicated the parties won't reunify while she is the leader. At least 6 people, including 2 teenagers, are still missing after a landslide struck a campsite at the Mount Maunganui Holiday Park in New Zealand. Search efforts are continuing and authorities believe they could carry on for days. 2 bodies, a grandmother and her grandchild, have been recovered from a separate landslide just to the south at Papamoa. And Australian actors Jacob Elordi and Rose Byrne are in the running for Oscars at this year's Academy Awards. Rose Byrne has received a nod for her leading role in If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You. Jacob Elordi, meanwhile, has scored a nomination for his performance as the creature in Frankenstein. That's in the supporting actor category. Horror flick Sinners, with 16 nominations, has broken the record for the most nods in the Academy's history. A low off the WA Kimberley coast is likely to form into a cyclone this evening. We'll keep you across that through the evening here on the news channel. Communities along the coast are following advice to gather supplies, including the residents of Jarrington.